"You can't do this!" she screamed, and for one stupid second I almost believed her. Karen's voice ricocheted off the century-old farmhouse like a verdict, and she was standing there in her navy blazer heels sinking into the gravel clipboard held like a Bible, except this wasn't a sermon, it was a declaration of war. I laughed quietly because it was either laugh or cry, and because the idea that a woman with a badge could tell me what to do with my grandfather's land felt like a bad joke. I drove back to that farmhouse after my grandfather died, 6 months of paperwork grief that never quite left the ribs, and a job in Chicago that felt more like a cage than a career. And when I pulled up the long dirt drive, the place I remembered had been swallowed by a sea of identical roofs, beige and gray and polite, each lawn trimmed to the same submissive height and little green HOA signs stuck like flags at every corner. The wraparound porch sagged where it always had the oak with the old tire swing still stood, but the fields that used to roll to the horizon were gone, replaced by neat rows of suburban certainty. That's when the cognitive dissonance hit me like cold water, and Karen made sure it stung. She arrived the day I moved my last box in like a shark-smelling blood clipboard badge, the whole theatrical performance, and announced that my family farm violated community standards, that I had 72 hours to fix the paint, the landscaping, the visible agricultural equipment, and that fines would accrue daily, $200 here, $100 there, a little financial drip that could, the way she smiled, drown you. Foreclosure, she said casually, like it was a weather forecast. I stood on my grandfather's porch with that stack of paper and watched her drive off, and I felt like the protagonist in a small suburban horror story. That first night I spread my grandfather's documents across the kitchen table, deed survey maps, old tax records, and the pages looked like autumn leaves, brittle and full of secrets. Margaret Foster, his attorney, called voice steady. "Tommy, your grandfather was strategic. When you're ready, you'll remember what really matters about that land." She told me to sleep on it, but sleep didn't give answers. Ghosts of conversations with my grandfather did. He'd muttered once while fixing a tractor. "Sometimes you let people show you who they are, then you decide what kind of neighbors you want." I'd filed that away as some old man riddle until Karen started writing me tickets. The inspections began in earnest. The next morning, Karen returned with 2 guys and a camera. They took pictures of the peeling barn, the mailbox, the uneven driveway, like crime scene photographers cataloging my family's life, and handed me a fresh violation, $350 per day, until compliance. When I looked at the HOA's boundary map, my blood went cold. It claimed jurisdiction over 80% of what I'd thought was my land. The line they'd drawn on paper shifted the horizon. I couldn't accept it, and yet also, I'd ignored a lot of things over the years. I'd let the paperwork stack up, I'd let the details slip, and maybe that was the point. By the end of the week, the fines stacked like small metallic lies. $50 for a flower bed, $75 for a clothesline, another $100 for a tractor that had rusted behind the barn like a sleeping beast. The psychological part was worse. Karen arrived like clockwork at 7:30, clipboard glinting, and seemed to savor the humiliation. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, some sympathetic, some awkward. Susan Williams next door, an old woman with a soft jaw, leaned over the fence and whispered, "She's done this before. Tommy, families out, paint jobs, money taken. Be careful." The word evicted landed in my chest like a fist. I went down to the basement where my grandfather's smell still lingered, oil, old wood, and that earthy thing that reads like memory, and in a cardboard box labeled property records, I found the map from 1924 tax rolls, across decades and letters my grandfather had written to county officials. He had been collecting proof for years, building permits granted without proper title verification, emails and notes proving that structures had been built on Smithland without consent. There was also an entry in his journal, "I will never forget. The boy will understand when he's ready." That sentence sat on the page like a fuse. Enter the twist. The second character who changes the whole tone. Robert Johnson, my grandfather's old friend and the kind of man with a porch that remembers everything. Robert pulled out a manila folder thick enough to sink a small boat and methodically walked me through what my grandfather had documented, continuous tax payments on a massive parcel surveys showing the Maplewood development built atop Smithland, legal opinions written by lawyers who'd said in effect, if improvements were made on land without the owner's permission, the improvements belonged to the owner. In other words, the playground, the community center, the tennis courts, all improvements on our dirt likely belong to my family. The twist wasn't just that this was possible, it was that my grandfather had let it happen on purpose to see what kind of people would be in charge. Margaret told me what to do: document everything Karen did, keep a record of every text, every threat, and be ready. But she also suggested a strategy less nuclear than simply tearing the neighborhood down: offer reasonable ground leases, a path to legitimize what had been built, and an ultimatum: stop the harassment or face eviction for trespass. It's one thing to have the law on your side, another thing to wield it without becoming the villain. My grandfather's long game had always been about teaching, not wrecking. So I did the thing. Good stories asked for. I walked into Karen's immaculate driveway at 8 on a Friday morning, folder under my arm like a briefcase of dynamite, and I asked for answers. She reacted the way tyrants do, with rage, then panic, then bargaining. I showed her the original deed, the tax records. I walked her through the property lines, stopping at the playground with its swing sets where kids laughed and parents watched, and Karen's face drained of color. "We have permits," she said. "We have incorporation papers." "Permits depend on what information you're given," I replied. "If someone tells the county they own land they don't own, the permits are invalid." That line, "if someone tells the county they own land they don't own," was the crack in her armor. She threatened to take us to court, to call the cops, to grind this into a decade-long legal war. We sent notices of trespass to every common area, and we offered modest lease agreements for families who wanted to legitimize their homes without uprooting their lives. The choice: that's where the drama lives: pay a fair ground rent and have democratic governance, or face eviction and a messy legal fight. People hate being told they have to choose, but they also hate being punished for things beyond their knowledge. The community meeting that was Act 3. Karen took the podium, and for about 10 minutes she was the general of a doomed army. "He's trying to steal our homes," she proclaimed, and the room filled with anger and fear. I set up a projector and laid out the old maps, the tax records, the correspondence. The gasps in the room were the kind of sound that shifts a narrative. People began to understand that this wasn't an evil developer scheme, it was a legal reality. Someone asked the question I'd been waiting to hear: "Why didn't your grandfather do this earlier?" "Because he wanted to see what people would do with power," I said. "Because he wanted to know if neighbors would be neighbors." Karen cornered, unraveled. She barricaded herself in her house for days, convinced the end of the world was upon her, convinced the notices were part of a conspiracy. Paranoia pushed too far breaks people, and within a week she was in a psychiatric hold, an outcome that felt simultaneously like karmic punctuation and like a human tragedy. I didn't want that. Nobody did. But the consequences of 20 years of running a community with an iron clipboard were coming due, and life has a way of collecting balances. What happened after the worst of it is the part that surprised me, and maybe that's the moral. People signed leases, most residents chose stability over upheaval, and the HOA's revenue model was restructured into something transparent and fair. Property values didn't collapse, they rose. Neighbors started hanging laundry again, planting community gardens, and the playground filled with noise rather than fear. Karen, after treatment, showed up at my porch one morning in jeans and a sweater, not a blazer, and for the first time she apologized without an agenda. She began to write personal restitution checks, volunteer, and most wrenching, teach kids how to plant tomatoes in the community garden she once used as aesthetic leverage. Redemption arrived messy and late, not triumphant, but real. If there's a lesson here, and I promise I'm not waving a megaphone, it's this: power without accountability becomes tyranny, but accountability without cruelty opens space for repair. My grandfather's inheritance wasn't just land or money. It was the strategic patience to see how people behaved when given authority, and the willingness to step in and redirect that authority toward community benefit. That's faintly poetic, I know, but after watching a neighborhood go from fearful to flourishing, I'll take it. The satisfying part for those who want the neat ending is this: the community transformed. The woman who used to wield a badge like a weapon now helps mediate disputes, coordinates volunteers, and shows kids how to identify beneficial insects. She still carries the memory of what she did. She still faces consequences, but she's chosen a different path. The playground is still there, the community center hosts movie nights, and people trade squash and stories on Saturday mornings. The legal papers sit in a safe, not as a scalpel, but as a reminder. And I'll leave you with a question that I want to sting a little when someone in power has abused it. Do we punish them until they're broken? Or do we demand repair and allow for the possibility of redemption? Even when that redemption comes from someone who caused real harm? Tell me what you think. Did I do the right thing? Offering leases instead of burning it all down? Have you ever watched a system of small tyrannies fall apart? I want to read your stories, drop them in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from, and let's argue about whether justice is about revenge, restitution, or mercy. If this moved, you share it, because sometimes change starts with a single folder, a stubborn lawyer, and a community finally deciding to be neighbors again.
Cảm ơn các bạn đã xem video.